Hey guys, here we're going to first off look at just a few things that I've done since the last video, but the main brunt of the video will be looking at taking this and posing it, which a pose always pushes your understanding of anatomy anyway, but it also creates a result that people are going to react to more strongly than something that has essentially no life to it. I mean, if this was made for a rig, then the tail would be completely out straight as well, and it would just look like the weirdest thing, you know. And for the kind of time that you put in and the result that you get out, taking a bit of time to just pose something even subtly will make a huge difference. Like, it could be as small as here, just well, that's lucky, didn't realize that widget was going to be right in the middle there. Yeah, even something as small as just rotating the head like this. Suddenly it's just like, well, okay, there's some character to it, there's some thought happening in the head, which there isn't when everything, I mean, it doesn't help the fact that I've got perspective off, but you know, when everything is constrained to a single axis. So well worth investigating that, and as we've looked into in other classes, just super important in terms of broadening your understanding of anatomy, like what happens when one of the arms lifts or something like that happens. And yeah, but before I go into that, sorry, I'm getting distracted by correcting some things in my own sculpt. I want to talk about the difference between last time you saw this and now, which is maybe about 30 minutes work, but the main emphasis was kind of starting to hit just smaller beats. You see here, these would be the serratus muscle, doing the exact same thing as they would do on a human, incidentally, right? Coming from the scapula, grabbing hold of the side of the rib cage, so when they pull, they can pull the scapula in towards that point there, so they're involved in the movement of the forearm, or sorry, not the forearm, of the forelimb, which is the arm, and then like an indication of ribs through there, which, you know, once you've got your big things working, you can then just go right, bosh, 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 stick in some things that are going to look like ribs, and suddenly it starts to come to life, and it's not like those small forms aren't insignificant. They're talking to you about, well, like, let's say how thin the skin is in that area, or how little muscle there is in that area, and you know, exaggerating or not exaggerating, but making clear the fact that the rib cage comes to that point there. So every little area that you deal with here, I clearly have exaggerated the sharpness of that, but just to go, okay, that's bone, and then this is a bit of muscle coming off that, but it's not, you know, this would be the tens fasciae latae, and it's not super massive and strong and developed, so I'm losing and finding it quite a bit. So all of these little decisions mean something, but of course, like I don't know what I would bid on this if I was bidding for it as a final asset, but you know, you kind of want at least a couple of weeks of modeling time on that, certainly more than 3 hours or something like that. But if you approach your sculpt in the right sort of way, you can fake it, you know, and that's essentially what I'm talking about there. And like with adding the veins and, you know, the very superficial details to the surface, it's like, yeah, if you look at anything in close depth, it'll break down. But if as a general visual impression it's working, then you know that you're getting the priorities kind of right. So in terms of actually studying these forms, you know, to bring it directly to this idea of comparative anatomy, you don't have time necessarily to do, like, you know, a perfect horse sculpt, a perfect lion sculpt, a perfect dog sculpt, and be able to understand the similarities and differences between these things. But you have time to sketch it out, and if your sketches aren't hitting it, then it means that you're not prioritizing well enough. So at any given point in your sculpt, go, okay, if I could only change one thing or 5 things, what would those things be? And by constantly thinking about it in that way, then it's going to allow you to move to an end result a bit quicker. So anyway, that's just a kind of a summary of where I got to there, and let's just, because it's fun, let's do this just a few more times. Okay, that's enough. I'm satisfied. So now, before I look into posing, I want to show you this, which is a fairly badly done scan. Right, this may be like 6 or 7 years old, so I didn't know so much what I was doing when it came to scans, and the technology wasn't so good. So that's my excuses in there. But this is a sculpt by French animalia. The movement was called the Animalias, 19th century movement of artists who focused specifically on animal sculpture and painting, which for a long time that was always kind of like, yeah, you'd have animals in sculpture and painting, but not just by themselves, generally speaking. Like, you couldn't have an animal for the sake of it, and then at some point you could, and so then that's what the Animalias were doing. And if you've been to a gallery and seen like a realist animal sculpture that you like, it's probably Barry who did it. Like, he's the most prominent of those guys, and I would really recommend you look him up if you're interested in animal anatomy in general. That's Bayre, Barry, Antoine Louis Barry, and yeah, this is a sculpt that I have. You know, it's just it's not very big. It's a foot long or something. You can buy it from the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, I believe, or in Washington. I don't remember. Some place, but I mean, it's extortionately expensive for what it is. But very, very useful to have these things as reference. You know, because like a scan or obviously an actual 3D, real life 3D object allows you to appreciate things that you just can't from a 2D image. So I want to talk a little bit about what it is that I'm thinking as I'm looking at this, and how I'm breaking it down. And what I'm not going to do, incidentally, is turn this horse into this one, because they're clearly different. This is, well, the name of the sculpture is Turkish horse. I really don't know enough about horses to know the differences between breeds or whatever. I can just look at this guy and go, okay, he's a stocky, more muscular guy than mine. My guy's kind of elegant and lean. So clearly it's a different set of proportions, and I'm not going to try and match. I'm just going to try and take the essence of the pose and see if I can learn something more about horses and more about how Barry, who was, you know, the top of his craft, worked with animal anatomy in his sculptures, what he exaggerated, what he left behind, and steal that for myself, right? And then teach it to other people like I'm the clever one. It's kind of the pretty much my career in a nutshell, you know. If you go and look up the Robert Beverly Hale videos, there's some of them online, you'll see how much I steal directly from him, because he was a fantastic anatomy instructor. Anyway, so what am I looking for here? Same as if I'm working on a human pose, you know, like what is the spirit of the pose, what is the main gesture, and that is generally set up by these three big bony masses: the skull, the rib cage, and the hips. And on a horse, they're just, you know, even more massive than they are on a human. So what is the relationship between those? How are they working together? Where do they create compression? Where do they create extension? And what is the line and gesture that they set up? Well, what's interesting here is, especially in the shoulders, can you see that? There's like this strong tilt through there. And this is where, like, if we were, you know, the exercise that we've been doing is converting a human into a quadruped, but we could look at it a different way and go, what are the fundamental building blocks of a quadruped? And through here, you could pretty much stick a box in there. Right? You have a box for the that would give you the shoulder girdle and scapula, and then like a stretched out cylinder for the neck. You know, you could certainly do that. And in Goldfinger's anatomy book, he does a pretty good job of that. And obviously, we've spoken about, you know, there's a clear box in there, and there's a clear like curved box through there. You know, and then clear cylindrical masses. And if you're thinking about things in those terms, then all you need to do is rotate the box, and that gives you the gesture of that whole upper body area, the whole shoulder area. And then you go with the hips. Well, okay, they're much more even through there. So that tells us that there is a twist and a spiral moving down the sculpture. So that's one thing that I want to look for. And then the fact that he's rearing up. So, you know, if we go back to a human is obviously reared up completely. You just wouldn't call it reared up in a human, you call it standing up. But that's essentially what it is, and that's why we have such big lumbar muscles through here and such big glutes, because they are pulling our body upright, and our feet are pretty much right in the center of the body, right? So they can support all of that weight. Whereas, of course, on a quadruped, that is distributed through 4 points rather than 2. So there is no need for the feet to be right at the front of the body. They can be structured much more like a kitchen table, right, where you have the feet in each of the corners. However, here, as he's reaching up, that's moving more towards the human position, so the feet are having to come more into the center to support that. And so as you're working with poses, whether, however you're doing this, whether it's human anatomy, animal anatomy, whatever it is, just make sure that you're thinking about it. I know this is something that I repeat a lot, but it's not good enough just to look and copy, and like, as you come up with various theories or whatever, you can then research them, investigate them. But to be honest, like, a lot of the time I come up with an idea or a theory, and I don't mind that much whether it's accurate. Like, of course that matters, but it's like, okay, well then I can tell the story of that, and that ultimately is more important than accuracy. That's a huge difference between like what we're doing here and what a vet would do or what a doctor would do, right? So moral of the story is just think, so yeah, in this pose we've got like, the body is being pushed backwards significantly. This leg, you can see it's a support there, but that's leading into this push backwards, and then these legs are coming under to support that extra weight that is getting pushed through there. And the fact that we've got this strong tilt shows us that the weight is getting dropped onto that side, which is allowing him to lift that arm up through there. And so this arm basically, or this front section of the sculpture, for me becomes like the real key of the sculpture, and this back just sort of unifies it. So what's interesting is, like, you have a lot of movements going this way, right? If we look at the other leg, there's similar movements, a lot of movements in that direction, the tail as well. The mane, you see, even with the mane, he's using that as an element to push all of these diagonal lines moving forwards through there. And then the head breaks that and drops the other way, so that gives the head some sort of dominance and some sort of relevance, and this arm is doing the same thing as well. So those two beats kind of reinforce each other, and those are the dramatic beats. So the majority of the movement is going the opposite way, and you just have these two kind of counterbalances to that, which are crucially important. There's also, all of this stuff here is just from the bad scan. If you were looking at the actual sculpt, then you would see, like, this would be negative space through there, and what you would see then is like that movement and that movement kind of reinforcing themselves. And that's that's an interesting thing, because I'm not saying all of this stuff would necessarily be intentional on Barry's part. Like, when you're at that sort of level, a lot of this stuff will be indistinguishable from instinct. But in order to develop that as instinct, or something that appears like instinct, you've got to think about it, and you've also got to get it into your DNA. And you can't get it into your DNA without being surrounded by it and without studying it. So, well, that's why I want to do a separate video just talking about this, because I feel like this stuff isn't kind of vocalized enough. And like this idea that we just mentioned of that unifying the front and back, like that's what you would want, even if this was a really wacky concept design, right? If you've got something clearly different happening at the front and clearly different happening at the back, which is what I see a lot of drama at the front and then just like a supporting structure at the back. You kind of want some idea to bring those two disparate elements together and to unify them somewhat. And then as we go through and start to move the sculpt into the pose, then we can look at it in terms of specifically what's going on with the anatomy. Like, I don't know if you remember, but I was saying one mistake people always make is they don't peel off the layers of muscle. Same on a human, right? People don't peel off the latissimus and traps, so they never learn the structure of the back. And through here, you'd have the tens fasciae latae doing something like that. But if you peel it off, you can see the movement of the quads going through there, and so you get that movement rather than that. And like Barry would have known that like the back of his hand. But if you just open up an anatomy book, or even like if you've got a good quality écorché, horse écorché, it wouldn't necessarily tell you that. So that's where referencing an artist who really knows the ins and outs of what he's doing is pretty important. But anyway, we're going to talk more about that as I get on to actually doing the sculpt. So I know this has been a pretty talky sort of video, but hopefully there's some interesting points to think about there.